in orca whale research?
In a very roundabout way, I suppose would be a summary, Mike. I was at UCLA doing a PhD in brain science, and I needed a job, and I was a New Zealand citizen, so it was easier for me to find a job in Canada, I thought. And I had a friend in this at UBC, University of British Columbia, who I knew from New Zealand. I wrote to him, asked if there were any jobs. He said no, but there was a job in the, it's called the Kinsman Laboratory of Neurological Research, which involved brain science. And it also involved half-time research with an orca, a newly captured orca at the Vancouver Aquarium. Sounded interesting. I knew nothing about orcas at that point, but I had a person on the UCLA campus, a famous cetacean scientist named Dr. Ken Norris, and I talked to him about what I might propose. And he suggested, because so much was known about audition in dolphins, cetaceans, that I look at vision. So I made a proposal about studying vision in orcas. Came up, applied for the job, got it, and it went on to do some work that looked at the question of vision, and I also looked at questions of motivation and stuff like that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it didn't take me very long to realize that keeping an orca in a small concrete tank, shut off from all of the acoustic environment that he or she depends on, and separated from the family is a very unfair thing to be doing. When I expressed this opinion publicly, I lost my job and ended up in Alert Bay, which is known because I still wanted, obviously, to learn about orcas, particularly in the wild. I ended up in Alert Bay, which is known as the home of the killer whale. And that led me to Hansen Island, which is where I set up a camp in 1970 and just started observing orcas in the wild for the first time. Put a hydrophone in the water, started listening to them for the first time. And it became a habit. Year after year, we would go back in the summertime to Hansen Island and gradually built up a base there, which is what Orcalab has become today.
And it sounds like we have some audio issues, so let me read that message. Apologize for this, folks. If you... Okay, so maybe we'll pause right here, and we'll try to correct that. So Candace, yes, if you could please restart the stream, and maybe we'll fix that audio issue.
Do you want me to speak?
No, you know what? Your audio is actually quite fine. I think I sound like I'm a robot, so we'll try to figure that out. Okay, and we're back. So Paul, we were talking about how you became involved in orca research, and you said something interesting. You know, you immediately realized that, you know, holding these animals in tanks where they were shut off from the natural stimulus that they would experience in the wild, that enrichment, was that really the catalyst for you that inspired you to start Orcalab? You wanted to experience or excuse me, research those whales in the wild instead of in captivity?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I did actually continue in another venue looking at orcas in captivity, but obviously they come from the wild, and the little experience I had with them in captures at a place called Pender Harbor on the seashore coast north of Vancouver gave me the sort of the direct interest in finding out more about their life in the wild. And that's what led me to Alert Bay and to Hansen Island. And I have to say I'm very thankful for that, because it's my life on Henson Island has been extremely rich in the sense that the location is incredible, wonderful. It's the place that I suppose I love most in the world, and it's given me an amazing opportunity to follow the life story of orcas from generation to generation for quite some time now.
And is that one of the main research goals of Orcalab? Is to follow the lives of these whales in the wild from generation to generation? And do you have other research goals that you try to accomplish?
Well, certainly that's the large goal. Within that, there are many smaller ones. We are, for example, very interested in the dialects that orcas use, and in following the story of the dialects in the different. They're called clans, which are groups of families that share dialects within them, but not between the other clans. That's one thing. We're very, very interested in the social relationships among the different orca families. I'm personally fascinated by the fact that these are the largest, most ferocious predators in the world, yet they have developed a peaceful lifestyle.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about orcas and their lifestyle. A lot of people are familiar with what they look like, with their striking black and white coloration. But if you can indulge me for a moment, beyond their physical features, what makes an orca an orca?
Well, certainly the family, I think, is a very key part of that explanation. Orcas are born into, at least the resident orcas, I should say, which are the fish-eating type of orcas. They're born into a family group. They stay in that family group for their entire lives. They have other groups that they relate to. For example, in our area, especially in the summertime, these orcas, they're called residents, partly because the place where they came to, commonly in summertime, made it feel as though they were resident. They're not quite resident in that area. They have a large range that they roam about in on the coast of British Columbia, even into southeast Alaska. But they're called residents, and they are fish-eating animals. They eat fish exclusively. They eat a couple of varieties of salmon, particularly Chinook salmon and chum salmon. Chinook are their primary targets. And the lifestyle I just find so fascinating, because these groups of families that know each other really well, even though in a sense they speak an entirely different language, they get along really well together. They're always, in our area, we see family groups coming in and sticking around for, sometimes weeks, and other families will come in. And it's always an occasion of great excitement when a new family comes into the area, and they meet up with some of their old friends. And they go about together for some time, could be days, weeks, even maybe just briefly. But they're obviously very, very comfortable in each other's presence. They never show any signs of conflict, for example. And so to me, the orcas have really developed a lifestyle that works for them over the long term. And I have to say, I compare that to ourselves, which we're in severe trouble at this point.
Yeah, there are very few mammals, I think, that science and just general observations have demonstrated that have the family life comparable to humans. And orcas are definitely one of those species. You also touched on a couple of things that are interesting about whales in the Pacific Northwest, orca whales in the Pacific Northwest. You've mentioned the residents. There's a couple of different groups that utilize this area, but they don't intermix really. So can you explain the differences between those two main groups of orcas? I think a lot of people will call them, you may hear bigs or transient whales as one group, and then the residents. Can you explain maybe some of those differences between those two groups?
Yeah, sure. The residents, as you say, are solely fish-eating animals. The bigs, or transient orcas, are marine mammal-eating animals. They don't eat fish at all. They're called bigs because they're named after the scientist, Dr. Michael Bigg, who originally identified them as a separate type of orca. In any event, they have in many ways a different lifestyle. They certainly have very different dietary habits. They, as I said, exclusively eat marine mammals. They eat, for example, seals, sea lions. They prey on dolphins and other cetaceans, even large whales. Although I think most of the time they have a pretty difficult time with much larger whales. But they have a very different, not just different diets, but different habits. They occupy the entire coast, all the way from Alaska down to California. But within that, they seem to have preferences for some areas. One of the scientists has described them as having a trap line, in the sense that they have favorite places that they go to find their preferred food, places, for example, where seals might haul out. And at this point, even though the whole coast is open to them, there are certain places, and we are in our area, we see the same groups of bigs very often, and they come at any time of the year. That's the other thing about them, I guess. The resident fish-eating orcas tend to be focused on salmon, and so much of their sort of habits are related to the salmon runs. And in the Johnston Strait, where we are, it's one of the main routes that salmon take from the open ocean down into the lower part of BC, where the Fraser River comes in. And the Fraser River is one of the very large rivers where salmon spawn and that are so critical in a way to the life of resident orcas. And that, by the way, is part of the present problem that the orcas are facing, because salmon are in trouble and the river systems that they inhabit are in trouble.
Yeah, I want to get back to that point, especially about salmon in just a little bit. But before we talk about some of the challenges that whales face, one more question that I am curious about is which community of whales are we more likely to see when we're watching the Orcalab cameras? Are we more likely to see those bigs whales, or are we more likely to see the residents?
Actually, we see both on the Orcalab cameras. In the wintertime and in the springtime, we're more likely to see bigs than resident orcas. But at this time of year, the humpbacks are starting to come in, so we will also see humpback. In the summer season, we mostly see resident type of orcas. We can follow them on our cameras. We have a number of cameras that enables us to track them from one place to another. They enter through Blackney Pass, and then they head down towards Robson Bight, which is an ecological reserve, and then the Ring Beaches, which is the place that we're looking at right now. And so they have it's kind of a circuit that they go on. And the cameras that we've put in place with the help of Explorer enable us to track the whales from one viewpoint to another. And so they're really extremely helpful in terms of us figuring out what the whales are actually doing. We also have a complementary network of hydrophones that we listen to, which covers actually a little bit more of it than the cameras cover. But they enable us to pick up acoustically what the where the whales are, and essentially because of the dialects that they use, get to understand who they are. And again, we can follow them sort of from one field of listening to another and track them acoustically. So between the camera network and the hydrophone network, we get a lot of information about who's there and what they're doing.
And if you want to learn more about the hydrophones and the dialects of these whales, you can always go to orcalab.org, and they have a lot of great information on there and links to places where you can listen in to the whales as they're swimming through the water. But Paul, you mentioned salmon before, and how salmon are the main foods, especially of those resident whales. They are fish eaters. And while orcas are perhaps maybe the only large species of whale that wasn't extensively hunted in the 19th and 20th centuries, that doesn't mean that their populations never experienced dramatic declines for other reasons. That doesn't mean all is well for them right now, especially those southern resident whales. So maybe we can get back to the issues associated with them. Can you talk, maybe touch on just a little bit of the plights that those southern resident whales in particular are facing right now?
Yeah, sure. Southern resident orcas have been impacted by a number of things in the past. I think that the captures that happened in the 1960s and 70s had a huge impact, not just on that generation, but on succeeding generation. There were more than 60 whales. I think by one count, I get just about 70 of a population that may have been only about 120 at that time, were taken out and sent off to captive environments like SeaWorld, for example. And so the whales that they were taking were, generally speaking, younger whales. So a whole age class of young orcas was taken out of that population in the 60s and 70s. And I think a lot of the trouble that the southern residents are happening at this time date back to that time. But more recently, you add a bunch of other factors. The depletion of their main food supply, salmon, is the biggest one probably. They focus, as I've said, on Chinook salmon, and the Chinook salmon are really in trouble. They're considered endangered in many ways at this point. There have been restrictions on catching them. For example, the Seine fishery has not been able to catch them for decades. But there are other kinds of fisheries that still take place. The biggest impact, I think, is from this fishery. And even though there have been recent attempts to somehow restrict the number of Chinook that the sports fishery has taken, in my opinion, they still take far too many. And that I believe that it would be much more helpful to the orcas if all of the Chinooks were devoted to them. In other words, stop all other fisheries, commercial fisheries, sports fisheries, and nations fisheries for a period of 5 years, and see if that will be helpful to the orcas. Right now, southern residents are down to 75 individuals. It's a very clear path to extinction within, say, 3 or 4 decades, 5 decades, And we have a colleague, her name is Alexandra Morton, who I think said something that is absolutely profound. She says that if we allow the southern resident orcas to go extinct, it will be the first extinction in which everyone's name was known. Think about that. We know all of those whales. We know them all as individuals. We know they're in trouble. Why not go out of our way? Give it up for the orcas is the line that we're using. So allow the orcas to take all of the Chinooks, hatchery Chinooks, wild Chinooks, all of them. Allow them all to the orcas and see if it will help bring them back from the brink of extinction, which is really what they're facing now.
And I live actually along the Skagit River, which drains into Puget Sound. It's actually it's right behind me. You can't see it on the camera right now, but it's right behind me. And this is one of the major salmon producing rivers for the Puget Sound region and the Salish Sea. So it's very important for fish just for spawning habitat. A lot of the spawning habitat is fairly well intact. Like the Skagit watershed isn't in dire straits like a lot of other salmon producing streams, but salmon face so much. We were talking about this before the chat. They face so many different pinch points during their lives. So if spawning habitat is reduced, or maybe spawning habitat is there for them, that doesn't mean the rearing habitat is there for them. And that's one of the big things about the Skagit River, is that the floodplain has been heavily modified so that the little fish that hatch don't have as many places to actually live right now. So even if there's a lot of fish coming back, that doesn't mean a lot of fish can survive to run back out to sea. So with salmon, it's going to take a lot of, I think, sacrifice on the humans to make sure that for the runs to support, you know, of course, whales, but all of the other species that are dependent on them. It's really hard to overstate the importance of salmon to ecosystems where they exist, because they really are the keystone of so many different things, and especially these whales that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. And, you know, I've talked about Chinooks and the need to preserve them and make them available to orcas as food, but there are other pressures. You know, noise is a huge factor. And when you think about the southern residents particularly, you're thinking about whales that live in an incredibly noisy, noise-polluted environment. The shipping traffic that happens through the habitat that they live in is unbelievable. You have all of the ships heading to Seattle and Vancouver, Victoria. All of them are passing through the prime habitat that orcas depend on, and they're incredibly busy. And so you have a situation where there's so much noise in the water that the orcas have a difficult time finding the food that they need. As many of the audience will certainly understand, orcas find fish acoustically. They use a form of sonar called echolocation, which it enables them to identify the fish that they're hunting. And when noise happens in the water, that interferes with that ability to hunt effectively. So it's a really big problem for them. I think many of the authorities, for example, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada and NOAA in the United States, are very aware of the noise issue. And for example, there have been some movement of shipping lanes coming in through the Strait of Juan de Fuca into Puget Sound in Georgia Strait that are helpful, I think. But at the same time, there are other impacts of noise. You have small boats, little fishing boats, whale watching boats, all kinds of other little craft that are contributing to the noise problem. And I think, you know, moving people back sort of in these recreational boats is helpful. But it's not going to solve the total problem. And I just think at this point, even though governments are taking some steps that are helpful, they need to see the much larger picture and take much more dramatic steps that they're doing right now.
And in your opinion, why do you think we should? Why do you think we should conserve whales? You know, I'm always curious about this. I have, of course, my own opinions about this, but I definitely want to know, you know, why protect these whales? Of course, you know, people we've heard them all say, or a lot of people say, well, there's going to be whales somewhere else. But I'm curious to know why you think, you know, we should protect these specific whales. You've touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, for sure. But let me just finish my last thought, which was about the effects of noise. The Port of Vancouver, this is unbelievable to me. The Port of Vancouver, which has a big shipping terminal at Roberts Bank, it's basically a coal shipping terminal. They're going to double it. At least there's a proposal to double it. The proposal being fought. But what they're talking about is doubling the amount of noise that these very large ships are producing in this critical environment for the orcas. I just think it's nuts. But to get to your question about why should we care? Well, I think the real answer is that orcas have become so symbolic and so much of an icon for many people that they have an importance just because of that reason. We care, the public at large cares about orcas. And I think that if you ask pretty much an average person in the public whether they think orcas should be protected or not, the answer would be yes. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it, I think, is that orcas have been around for a very, very, very long time. And they have managed to form this beautiful lifestyle of theirs in places that were free of humans for thousands and thousands of years, but now we've suddenly encroached on their habitat. I think that awareness that they have had the opportunity in the past to develop this wonderful life for themselves is something that we should recognize. And if we're able to do something to help them continue that wonderful life, we should.
Absolutely. When I think about these situations, I think about a quote from Aldo Leopold, who was one of the most famous conservationists of the 20th century. And in his book Sand County Almanac, and I'll probably butcher the quote a little bit, but he said it was regarding grizzly bears and how we were losing grizzly bears in most of the lower 48 states of the United States. And he said, relegating grizzly bears to Alaska would be like relegating happiness to heaven. One might never get there. So, and I think that applies to orca whales. I mean, each population is unique, each family is unique. So we owe it, I think, to these animals to make sure that they stay protected and that people in the future can enjoy them. Is I don't really think it should be our choice either. Because if we let them go extinct, then we stole them from future generations, and future generations might value them in higher than we do if we give them that opportunity.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I often think about the parallel with the climate issue. We know that the climate of planet Earth is in dire straits and that we are responsible for the problem. And the sad part of that is that we have the means of doing something about it. We're not doing very much at all about it. And we are leaving it to generations that follow us to feel the impacts. I often think about my grandkids, and I've got a bunch of them, and great-grandkids. I've got some of those too, but their lives are going to be so incredibly different from ours because of what we have done to the planet. And you can continue that line of thought and think about orcas, If we care about their future, we ought to be doing something now to help them.
And what could I think that is one of the questions that came up in our queue. We'll get to some viewer questions here in just a moment, but what can people do, someone at home, someone who's watching, to help conserve orca whales in the wild?
Well, it's actually a really crucial question, and the biggest thing is to make politicians, legislators aware of the need to protect these whales and to write to them. I would say, a personal handwritten letter to somebody in power, in an official position. In Washington State, for example, the Governor Inslee, is very much aware of the public interest and concern for orcas. Right to Governor Inslee. In Canada, With the federal government is concerned, but the actions being taken by the federal government are not enough. Write a personal letter to the Prime Minister, to the Fisheries Minister, Prime Minister Trudeau, Fisheries Minister, and explain from your heart why you're concerned. I think all of these things would be helpful. But beyond that, talk to people. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk, if you have opportunities to talk to media, write letters to the newspaper, all of these kinds of things to develop initiatives that will help protect the whales, I think ultimately will win the day for them. But at this point, we are not winning the day for them. We're not winning the day for climate. That's big time. And we're not winning the day for southern resident orcas, or even northern resident orcas, I have to say. They're generally northern residents, which is the population that we are most familiar with, are not in as dire straits as the southern residents are, but their population, which had been increasing at about 1.5% per year for decades, has now stopped growing. Last year, there was exactly no change in the population. It's the first time in a long time, but it's a warning sign. And you also have the from aerial photogrammetry that the body condition of some of the northern resident orcas, especially the A orcas, which are the ones that we follow most, are pretty much the same as J-pod. J-pod is in dire straits. So we're facing a situation here with the northern residents, which in many ways is beginning to parallel what's happening with the southern residents. And I would say take that as a warning sign, and let's do something about it.
And before we get to some viewer questions, I want you just two more quick questions on perhaps a lighter note. I'm curious to know, what about orcas inspires you the most?
Lots of things, I guess. Yeah, well, I'd say their lifestyle. We humans live in a world where we're constantly in conflict with one another, on an individual level or a group level. Orcas, and I touched on this earlier, have developed a lifestyle in which they essentially live in harmony with their neighbors, with one another. And they even live in harmony with completely different orcas, the bigs, transient orcas, and they've accomplished this, I think, by largely keeping out of each other's way. But if you look at the resident orcas, and you think about these three very large acoustic groups that I mentioned, they're called clans, and they're A, G, and R in the northern resident community. And the clans are groups of families that share elements of their dialects. Each individual family has its own special dialect, and within a clan, all of the families share elements of their dialects, so they're very comfortable and they know each other from the sounds they make. But they look at the separate clans, and their dialects are totally different. But yet, despite this very, very long-term history of developing, if you will, different languages, different dialects, they all know each other, and they get along with each other really well. They're completely separate at one level, but at another level, they're completely comfortable with one another. And if you extend that thought to humans, for example, and realize that how many conflicts we get that relate to very tiny differences in our lifestyles or background or whatever, I think you get the point. The orcas have developed a lifestyle. If we could emulate it, we'd have a much brighter future.
Well stated. Definitely, yeah. We can definitely, I think, start to emulate the lives of orcas to better our own future. We have a couple of viewer questions here that I'd like to get to. Do you have time to stick around for a few more moments?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
No,
let's see. So we've talked a little bit about some of these things, but it might be worth revisiting. Is there enough being done to save wildlife? Is there, what can the government do more? We've certainly talked about how it's important to write legislators, vote for politicians that take these issues seriously, and not only talk the talk but walk the walk. They're willing, I think, to take action to conserve species. I think that is really important. Um, one thing that we maybe didn't mention that I think is on your mind, Paul, is the Snake River. Is there something that maybe the government can do to help salmon populations in the Snake River, and by extension help orca whales?
yes, absolutely. I think there are 3 dams in the Snake River which should come down. If you look at Washington State, you'll already see that one dam has been taken down, the Awa Dam, and that salmon habitat is beginning to be restored in that system, and that's really helpful. But in the Snake River, which is another river, and I think there are 3 big dams on it, which are impeding the movement of salmon up to spawning areas, which are critical. And if those dams were taken down, I think it would be a big step in the direction of helping orcas. But it's a long-term thing, It would take, like, for example, if the government decided, okay, let's take those dams down, it will take years to fund them and to do the work and all of that. But let's get started on it. I think just making that decision would be really helpful. It took years once the decision to take the Awa Dam down was actually implemented, but it's helpful. In the much shorter term, we have to do things like, for example, give all the Chinook salmon to orcas. That would be really helpful, and it can be done with the stroke of a pen. That's what I don't get about all these initiatives and conversations and everything like that, which say, we're working on it, I say, let's stop promoting the idea that we're working on it. Let's do it.
And one final question here, and this is actually more of a natural history question from our audience. So somebody is wondering, do the orca whales mate solely within their own family? And if so, does that cause genetic problems? Do they have the ability to avoid inbreeding, especially in these populations that are kind of at a bottleneck right now?
Yeah, thanks. It's also an interesting question. The short answer is no. Orcas do not mate within their immediate family or even with close relatives. They mate at the genetic extremes. And I talked about the clans that are these groups of families which are generally, quite separate from one another. So what generally happens, it's not totally exclusively so, but what generally happens, that an orca female in one family group will mate with a female in another, with a male in another clan. It's usually the older males that are more successful at finding mates. But it's something I think that helps preserve genetic diversity in the population. But at the same time as saying that, you have to realize that this is a tiny population and that genetically it's really quite small. There's quite small variation within the entire population. So yeah, the answer is yes and no. No mating within the family, but mating still within a small population with a huge amount of genetic diversity.
Well, Paul, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've certainly learned a lot about orca whales, and I'm going to be, trying to do my part to help protect them in this region that I live in and I currently call home. For anyone at home who wants to learn more about orca whales and specifically the work that they do at Orcalab, please visit orcalab.org. And of course, go to explore.org/orcas if you want to see any of the live cams associated with Orcalab. It is one of the more scenic locations of any of the webcams on explore.org. And that's saying a lot because we have a lot of really pretty cameras, but the ones at Orcalab are great. Yes, sir.
Let me just add one more website, because we're
Sure.
always live streaming our audio, and we're always reporting about what's happening on it. It's orca-live.net. And there's a button on it that will turn on the acoustics that we're listening to in our lab. And if anybody wants to get more involved in what we're doing, yeah, try making a request to join our Orcalab 100 Facebook page, because we give a lot more information there.
Right. Sounds great. I might do. Yeah. Oh, I might do that. You might get a request from me shortly. So thank you, Paul, for joining me today. And again, this is Mike Fitz with explore.org. I hope you enjoyed our conversations about orca whales and their conservation. Please join us again soon.
Take care, Mike. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Bye for now.